Congressman, thank you so much for coming to join us here at the Center for Effective Lawmaking. I'll be asking you a series of fairly general questions, but would love to hear from you with specific examples from your own experiences
Okay.
as they come to mind. First, you served in the California State Legislature prior to your congressional service. How important was that prior service in helping you become an effective lawmaker once in Congress?
I thought it was very helpful. I experienced what it was to work with colleagues, try to get legislation through the legislature. Our legislature, and I think most state legislatures, are dominated by the speaker. I was in the assembly, which is the lower house, so to speak. We didn't call it the lower house. The other house was, of course, the state senate. And the speaker had complete control over everything. Your committee assignments, whether you're a chairman or a vice chairman of a committee, whatever responsibility that you might have, other than just being a member. So to me, it was terrific when I came to Congress, when you got on a committee and no one can take you off that committee, even if the speaker didn't like how you voted. You had an office, no one can throw you out of that office. But I learned many of my skills in the state legislature and was able to walk right into the position of being a member of Congress, representing pretty much a similar area than what I represented in the state assembly.
Great. You hold a JD from UCLA's law school. Was such legal training crucial for your lawmaking career?
It was very helpful. And I'm glad I went through a legal education. I didn't practice law for more than a year or so. I was much more involved in politics, and then I was running for office. And once elected, I gave up any legal career that I had, which wasn't, quite frankly, much. But a legal education gives you a way to look at issues and to see the different ways to approach them. So I thought it was useful. I had a request from a student here at UVA telling me he wants to be in public office, and he was finishing his undergraduate work. He was thinking of maybe doing some graduate studies, but he didn't know whether he should go to law school because he'd like to be in public office. And I said to him, it was valuable to have gone to law school, but not absolutely essential. One of the advantages of law school, if you're in the area where you might want to run for office, is you make a lot of friends who you might be able to call on later. But I think the education and the discipline was very useful for me to look at some of the flexibility that law might bring and some of the ways you could change the law to get a different result or to get a different nuance to a problem.
You've spoken in the past about how much you appreciated the role of Paul Rogers playing a consensus building role within the committee process. How did such consensus building efforts of committee and subcommittee chairs change throughout your time in Congress?
When I first came to the Congress, I wanted to continue with my specialization in health policy. And this was the first post-Watergate class. It was a huge class. People wanted to get on the Energy and Commerce Committee because we were facing severe energy crises. We had the boycott on us, and everybody wanted to deal with this issue. I wanted to get on Energy and Commerce because of the health jurisdiction, and I signed up for that committee. It's very hard to get on committee, but I was able to get it as a new member because there were a lot of vacancies from some of the people who had been there before, and the Democrats picked up so many new seats that more seats were available for Democrats that used to be held by Republicans. So I was able to get on the committee right away, and my first choice for a subcommittee was the Health and Environment Subcommittee chaired by Congressman Paul Rogers. He was a wonderful leader. He was a very distinguished man. He represented Palm Beach, Florida. He and his father had both represented the same area. And he was known as Mr. Health because he followed health policy. He tried to develop a consensus on the legislation that was going through his committee. He also had jurisdiction over environmental issues, particularly the Clean Air Act, which is an environmental law that affects health, the health of a population, as opposed to environmental issues that just protect our natural resources, as important as that is, but those were not necessarily in our committee. Paul Rogers tried to develop a consensus, which I thought was a good way to operate, but also gave me a lot more power, because when he tried to get a consensus, I knew that if I pulled to the left, and he was trying to get me on board and some of my colleagues who would follow me on these issues, he had to move more in our direction. So I thought the consensus was a good way to get people together, and it was a helpful way for me to have more of an impact from day one on the committee.
And is that sort of consensus building continuing in Congress today with committee chairs and subcommittee chairs, or is that a lost art?
Unfortunately, the House and the Senate have changed dramatically, but in the House particularly, we always looked for bipartisan ways to get things done. I always looked for that. That was what I hoped to achieve when I could set the agenda and say, I want to deal with this problem. And then I would try to get the members to focus on the problem, not whether their philosophy is this way or that way. And we could look at all the different alternatives. I sometimes set out a proposal and then got feedback from both parties, individual members who represented their constituents, but sometimes their ideology. And we would work through those issues to develop a consensus to move it forward. I authored a long list of legislation in the years I was in the Congress, and there was only one bill where it was partisan. Everything else ended up being bipartisan, not overwhelmingly bipartisan, but bipartisan nevertheless. Some of the presidents who had to sign the bills were Republican, but I always try to get a consensus in order to get the support that I needed. That didn't always happen right away, but if you listen to what your colleagues are saying, you try to accommodate them. Now, the Congress House particularly is different because there's more centralization of power in the hands of the Speaker and the leadership, and the members don't develop the expertise they used to develop as the people in that policy area. And sometimes the leadership of the House will hand them a piece of legislation and say, report it out. And members would have to vote it out, at least the majority party had to vote it out, without trying to develop a consensus. And today, if you listen to President Trump and the Republicans, their idea of a consensus is a consensus among Republicans. They have excluded the Democrats. That was something I never would have done as a Democratic leader, chairing a subcommittee and later a committee.
When you were thinking about trying to build consensus or reaching across the party lines and so on, we've sometimes heard that's what one does, and it waters down bills, or it moves them away from what your policy positions would be. When you were thinking about how do I get moderates on board, how do I get conservatives on board, was there a tension for you along those lines of watering down the proposal?
Well, you have to be willing to compromise. You can't get everything 100% your way. But when I would hear some of the concerns of other members who came in against the bill, I would look for ways to accommodate what they had to say. And that was useful. Sometimes hearing what they had to say reaffirmed my belief in the original bill, and then I wasn't willing to make the compromises. But the legislation, I think, invariably got better when we tried to develop more of a consensus. And you have to realize, when I came into Congress, the parties were very different. The Democratic Party had a majority, but often that majority was based on a small group of Democrats who were very, very conservative, often the Southern Democrats, who, when it came to voting in the House, would vote with the Republicans. And there were liberal Republicans in those days. On environmental issues, there were Republicans that we could call on to support the environmental position. Now that the two parties have become much more polarized on a whole range of issues. The Southern Democrats, who stayed Democrats for a long period of time, but then realized they weren't always going to get the chairmanship based on a straight seniority system, had pressure from their districts as Republicans became more popular to switch parties. And the Republicans that were more liberal were under pressure from their party to become much more conservative. So the parties are quite polarized on a range of issues that I wouldn't have thought would be partisan. For example, when I was in the state legislature, we dealt with the issue of abortion. Now, this was before Roe v. Wade, but it was always the Catholic Democrats that were against abortion. And the more moderate, more cosmopolitan Republicans liked the idea of abortion being available, partly, I thought, because they wanted to stop those minority groups and low-income people from breeding. And so they didn't mind if they had birth control. But it's hard to find a Republican that is pro-choice, and it's hard to find a Democrat that is so-called pro-life, because there's tremendous pressure if you're a Republican to be against abortions, even if you're not. In fact, we even had a couple of examples of members of the Congress who voted anti-abortion, but when it came to their girlfriends getting pregnant, they were urging abortions. And I'm sure that was true even when it wasn't that kind of a scandalous situation. But if their kids were in a difficult situation and they wanted to terminate the pregnancy, I don't think they struggled over it. And I had Republicans who told me that they're really pro-choice, but they felt they had to be voting with the anti-abortion groups because they'd always been there, and they didn't want to have the antagonism of the interest group that didn't like that they're changing that position. So the parties used to be different. After the big debates on the top line of the issues, people were more practical. They wanted to get things done, so we were able to work together, and the legislation came from the committees. Now it's coming from on top, and the majority party members are told they got to support it. With some occasions where they balk, but very often they feel that's their obligation.
You've described the loss of expertise that we might see among members within Congress building up that authority and expertise over time. Is that expertise being replaced? Where do we get the expertise that's necessary to make legislation today?
Well, there are fewer members with that expertise in their policy areas. There's some who worked enough in the area, and they may have a constituent interest, for example, in the defense side of things. They may have a military establishment in their district. They're very open to hearing what they say in the district about it. They're open to what the people in Washington say from the Department of Defense. So they get it from all sorts of different ways. And their policy is often determined by the pressures they get, the information they get from their district and in Washington. And they have a sense of expertise because they've been around on the committee and have heard the arguments for this weapon system, for example, versus that weapon system. Sometimes that's not completely separated from their constituent pressure or the pressure of the Washington people that are talking to them. But they can make their own judgments because they do have some background. More and more, I see members on issues that I know a lot about, and their information level is very, very thin, and they'll defer to their leadership. And some of them won't even bother to get involved. They just show up to vote with their leadership, which is not what I had seen in the past and would hope for today.
Now, the content of the bills that are, as you're saying, coming from the leadership themselves, where is that being developed, if not in committees? Who has the expertise necessary to put those pieces of legislation forward?
Sometimes it's the administration, if the administration's of your party. Sometimes it's from the leadership of the legislature, of the Congress, and they put the legislation forward, often to reward the contributors to their campaigns, part of their political world. But there are geographical differences between members from one part of the country to the other, city, urban versus rural. On environmental issues, where I worked a lot, we had regional differences, so that sometimes came to the surface. But more and more the pressure has been to forget about your district and go along with what the party wants, which is a shame. Sometimes the legislation is just handed to the leadership from the lobbying groups, and they just put it forward and move it. Either to put forward legislation. Now, not much legislation's been passing, but their views, such as stopping bills, is reflective of the politics. A good example of that is how I couldn't get the Republicans in the Congress to allow us to give the FDA, Food Drug Administration, jurisdiction over regulating tobacco, a completely unregulated product that killed more people than any other product that was legal. And it made so much sense to have some kind of regulation by the Food and Drug Administration. I went to Speaker Dennis Hastert and talked to him about it. I knew him. He had been in our committee before he was Speaker. And he was very nice, but it was Tom DeLay, the majority leader, who made the decisions. And he was so close to the tobacco interests that he was not going to do anything for us. And in fact, when he was indicted and had to go to Texas to plead on a criminal charge, he flew on the tobacco industry's airplane to go to Texas. So he just was not going to offend them. And while we had bipartisan support for regulating tobacco, because why should that be partisan? People die of cancer, or Democrats as well as Republicans. If you can't get a bill up because the leadership's in the pocket of special interest, very frustrating, but often happens. And that, just to give you an example on that issue, we had our landmark hearing in 1994 from the CEOs, chief executive officers of the major tobacco companies. They came in, took an oath to tell the truth, and then proceeded to lie. Oh, cigarettes are not harmful. Nicotine is not addictive. We wouldn't change the nicotine level to keep people addictive, and we never would market to kids. Every one of those statements turned out to be a lie. And so the demand, public demand for legislation was sparked. And then after that, we were getting insider information. I couldn't get a bill passed. For the most part, I couldn't even get a bill on the House floor until Barack Obama became president from 1994 to 2009. So the leadership can stop things, and sometimes special interest groups want to stop legislation more than they want to pass it.
Excuse me, before we continue, I'm going to move this mic down a little bit.
Oh.
A little bit of tie noise.
Oh, the tie in the way, or the voice not coming?
It's just the tie is rubbing up against the microphone.
Oh, okay. We don't want that. You've got to stop
Is
it.
that out of the shot, Steve?
Yeah, that's great.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
What did my tie say about these issues?
That's right.
It disagrees.
I know, I could feel it choking me.
That's hilarious. You've in the past noted some of the activities that you took to slow or stop environmental policy proposals that you opposed while waiting for the opportunity to advance your own proposals.
Yes.
Do you see these processes of slowing legislation down and advancing legislation as quite different, or are the same sorts of skills needed for what we might call obstruction and what we might call bill advancement?
I think you have to look at what you can control. And when I was chairman of the subcommittee on health and the environment, which had jurisdiction over the Clean Air Act, I wanted to slow that bill down because my Democratic chairman of the full committee, John Dingell, was from Detroit, and he sided with the auto industry, and he tried to put through a bill when Reagan became president that would have given every industry a break to pollute a little bit more. The only problem is that people with lungs had to breathe in more pollution and more ill health as a result. And so he was trying to ram that bill through. I took my time in subcommittee. I was able to have witnesses come in and talk about the problems with the legislation, the consequences if we did some of the things that were being proposed. Then we got to what we call markup. A markup is the vote in committee. And he was beating me with his Republican coalition, and the Democrats he was able to pull with him on every vote. So we developed a strategy to see if we could get one vote to go our way. And we were able to do it. And the theory was, since it was a weak coalition of interest groups that were going to get a break to pollute more, if some group didn't get their break, if Dingell couldn't deliver it to them, then all the other members of the coalition, with the exception of the auto industry, would say to themselves, well, these guys lost that, and maybe they're going to throw us overboard. So the whole coalition came apart. We were able to prevail, and we prevailed by one vote. We had a couple of Republicans, and there was one Democrat who later became a Republican that voted with us. So it was an issue of cancer-causing chemicals that were in the air. We would have lost. I don't know how much further it would have gone. We did have protection in the Senate because the Senate leaders on this issue were much more pro-environment. But it was a battle. And sometimes you don't know where the battle's going to go, and sometimes you speed it up if you've got the votes, and you slow it down if you don't.
Sounds like some of the same how do I build a coalition to advance legislation is playing out on the how do I build a coalition to at least stop on one vote at a time.
Absolutely. You have to try to develop the coalition. You have to be creative. You have to have allies. And continuously, in my view, press the merits of our issues to finally get people to realize that if they're just going to take the side of some big industry, they're doing a disservice. So some people came around to that point of view. Most didn't, but we were able to finally beat back a bad bill, and then we had to get a coalition to pass some of the things we wanted to move forward. We wanted to do something about acid rain, which is affected the Northeast in Canada with sulfur emissions that came down in the rain and killed the ponds and a lot of the vegetation. And that was a regional area of concern for people in the Northeast, Republicans as well as Democrats. But we had to build a consensus to get that part moving. For example, the pollution was coming from the power plants in the Midwest. They had tall stacks. The pollution, because it was a tall stack, would be carried hundreds of miles, maybe 1,000 miles, wherever the wind would take it. And the people in the Midwest didn't want to put scrubbers on that could limit the pollution. And they said, it's too expensive, and we'll have to pay, our ratepayers will have to pay too much for it. And I said, look, let's try to work this out. Suppose we had every ratepayer in the country add a few cents to their bill, which would be used to pay the extra cost for you in the Midwest to put on these scrubbers. Sounded to me like a good deal. They said, no. One, we don't think there's a problem. Two, we don't want the money. We don't want to do anything. Our utilities don't want it, and therefore we don't want it. When we finally adopted legislation on acid rain, we didn't give them any special deal. They had to limit the pollution. We had adopted a cap and trade program for limiting sulfur emissions. Some of the high sulfur coal in the eastern part of the country was not desirable anymore. They went to low sulfur coal. And there was an economic penalty that had to be paid that we might have avoided if we could have worked out a compromise. But sometimes the people you're trying to help just don't want to be helped to do the right thing.
Can we make one quick adjustment? One more thing on the.
Sure.
I'm just going to pull this out, and you can go ahead and start your question if you want, and then we'll just get this. Too much.
Oh, okay.
Thank you, sir.
What role did your staff play in helping you become an effective lawmaker and bringing about good public policy?
My staff was absolutely essential. We hired staff who were knowledgeable and expert in certain areas of our committee's jurisdiction, whether it's the Food and Drug Administration, the Medicare, Medicaid program, the environmental issues. public health. We had people who knew that subject and had an institutional memory and solid foundation for evaluating possible legislation. And I told my staff, I don't want you just to process the bills. I want you to help me advance the things that I believe in. And I assumed they believed in it as well. And they would help me figure out how to be an activist in the legislative process. But they were essential, and I always valued good, bright, constructive staff. I wanted people who are really smart, and I think there's a legacy of the Waxman staff around Congress. Many of them went on to the Obama administration. They went in different departments. They went to law firms. Most of them went into state and government, some academic. But I think they wore the badge of having worked for on my staff and the committee as a badge of honor.
Do you think your interaction with staff and your reliance on them and finding ways to empower them is something many members of Congress do, or is this a rare experience?
I don't know. I'm always amazed when I hear from my staff how some of my colleagues would treat their staff. And I'm just aghast at it. I would never know that because I see my colleagues when we vote and sometimes occasionally in a reception or an event. They're very nice people. But then, to me, but when they have some kind of power over their staff, they're very abusive, very mean. And I've been shocked at that. And it depends what the member wants to do. A lot of people in Congress have different goals than I always had. I wanted to get legislation passed. I wanted to make good policy. Many of them wanted to raise money for their re-elections, wanted to bring home the bacon, so to speak, for their districts. They were looking to run for another office, so they were trying to get attention to themselves for that purpose. Some of them cared about the issues, but they were not pushing to really make policy. I went recently to a former members event, and a couple of former members spoke, and they were particularly, in my mind, outstanding members of Congress. They were nice people, but I never remembered them having accomplished a lot. But one of them got up and said how he went to classes as a member, and he's still doing it as a former member, to talk about our democracy, how things could get better for everybody when they have representation, and how they need to let their members know what their views were. And I thought it was an excellent civics lesson for these classes. Another member would talk about how he'd have businesses come to him as a representative, and he tried to get something done for them because he was hearing from them. And one of them talked about, it was a Republican, how he needed legislation in the Clean Air Act itself to accommodate a problem in his district. So he came to see, he said to see John Dingell, who was chairman of the full committee. And John Dingell told him, go see me. So he came to see me. And I thought about it. And I saw the issue. And I said, well, we could do something this way that ought to solve this problem. And we talked to his staff, and his staff was, wow, what's Waxman trying to pull? They were so suspicious. And it took a long time before we finally realized them that what we said was what we meant, and it's what they wanted, and we were trying to accommodate them. So he didn't realize I was in the audience, and he said, I talked to Henry Waxman. He's a liberal. But I was able to work it out with him, which was fine. We got something done.
Great. You noted that the Food Quality Protection Act of 1996 did not get as much media attention at the time as you might have expected, but then you also wrote in your book, the important thing was not public fanfare, but the quality of the new law. When you think about the quality of a bill or the quality of a law, what does that term quality mean to you?
That the law is going to work, that it's going to accomplish a good purpose. It's not just to pass a law and say, hey, I authored a law. But I wanted to be sure the law was good. And in 1996, we had an interesting situation because we had lost the House for the first time in 40 years to Newt Gingrich and his aggressive Republicans who had fought hard to bring down the Democrats, and did successfully, and they took over. And they were riding high. They wouldn't even give President Clinton a budget, and they ended up closing down the government. And the public was outraged. I was pretty annoyed myself. I was sitting in my office late one night, and I was getting calls from people. I had reservations at Yosemite for my family, and now the Yosemite's closed, or this was the problem. And anyway, people were very angry. So the Republicans gave in and finally passed a funding bill, and then they were very nervous because he had just won control of the House, and they were worried that they'd lose it in the 1996 election. So the Republican chairman of the committee said to me, we want to get a bipartisan agreement on some bills so we can show some accomplishments. I said, well, I have no interest in trying to help you politically, but if we're going to get something done, I want to be sure it's real, that we're doing something worthwhile. As a result of that, we were able to pass a strong drinking water reauthorization for the drinking water law to make sure that the water we get in the faucet is potable, you can drink it. We passed a stronger bill that we couldn't, even when I was in the majority, get passed, which was to deal with the residue of pesticides from foods that were harming people, and to lower the pesticide levels or eliminate the pesticide levels. And we were able to get a breakthrough on that. And those bills we were able to get through because we just had backroom meetings. We had some hearings, but then we sat down and discussed the details. And when we reached an agreement, we brought the bill to subcommittee, brought it to full committee, passed the House, the Senate passed it. So there wasn't a lot of attention paid to it. And I had a woman in my district who cared a lot about this issue. She said her child had cancer. She was sure it was from pesticide residues. And she organized a group that was pressing for legislation. And I called her up and said, oh, by the way, we just passed the bill. She said, what? You just passed the bill? She said, I never heard anything about it. I wasn't interested in getting attention to it. I was interested in getting a good, solid bill. There are other instances where I could have gotten compromises to pass something. I don't want to just pass something. Mm-hmm. I wanted to be sure we passed the best we could, that we'd look back and say is really doing what we wanted it to do. And that's why some of the legislation I authored took decades to pass. People would come back and offer a compromise, and it wasn't really a reasonable compromise from my point of view. So we held more hearings, pressed the issue, tried to organize people on the outside, tried to develop support inside for the legislation, and eventually the pressure built up and people finally went along with what we wanted. Maybe we made a compromise here or there, but it wasn't on the guts of what we were trying to do.
How would you describe the interaction between your lawmaking role and your oversight role?
I think that's a very interesting question, because a lot of people think of Congress passing laws. But one of the most important things Congress can do is oversight, to hold hearings and to watch how the laws are being enforced, whether we need new laws, whether we need to eliminate some of the laws that aren't working or change them. Every committee of jurisdiction has legislative and oversight jurisdiction. So when we held hearings on harm from tobacco, it was in the Health Committee or the Energy and Commerce Committee. But I became chairman of a full committee that we changed its name to the Oversight and Government Reform Committee. When Gingrich became speaker, there were 3 standing committees, 3 full committees. And he said he was going to combine them into one. The Post Office and Civil Service Committee, the Committee on the District of Columbia, and the Government Operations Committee. And the Government Operations Committee had all the oversight jurisdiction over anything that you wanted to look at. And so I became chairman of that committee and ranking member when there was a Republican chairman. At first it was a Republican chairman who was impossible to deal with. His name was Dan, it'll come to me. He was a right-wing, not very smart, very partisan Republican from Indiana, Dan Burton. He was famous for shooting at a pumpkin to illustrate his theory of why a Clinton aide had been killed rather than killed himself. When he became chairman of the committee, they just were trying to make up scandals for the Clinton administration. They looked at how they handled their travel policy. They looked at how they handled this thing and that thing. They had a way of handling their oversight. They make an accusation that was wild and inflammatory, and then they would try to prove it and couldn't. Held a hearing, couldn't prove it. So then they'd move on to another wild allegation, and then the hearings would follow, and they couldn't substantiate what they were saying. They just did whatever they wanted to do, whatever they could do, throw enough dirt around and hope that some of it stuck. They accused President Clinton of being an agent of communist China. Well, you know, give me a break. So our job was just to fight back and illustrate how, one, he didn't have bipartisan support, which made him lose credibility because it looked like a partisan hearing, which it was. And we would just put out our leg and he would trip over it all the time. He would just make serious mistakes. That was the first part of the oversight. So he held hearings on trying to show the connection of vaccines for children and autism, a theory that has been discredited. And as a result of the high attention he brought to this issue, many parents were not immunizing their kids, and the result of which was that we were getting some of these diseases that we could have prevented coming back, like measles and others, whooping cough, others. So he was just very, very difficult. After he left as chairman, Representative Tom Davis from Northern Virginia took over the position, and he was a good person to work with. He was smart. He realized making accommodations with me would bring accommodations from me. We worked together. When he wanted to have a hearing, he wanted to have a credible hearing and get good results. It wasn't that he was completely independent. He came up to me one day and he said, I have subpoena power. I'm the only chairman of a committee that has subpoena power. And I'm going to subpoena this young woman that's being kept alive. I can't recall the name, but it was very attention gathering at the time. Everybody wanted to unhook her from life supports, but the Right to Lifers wouldn't want that done, so they were trying to get Davis to hold a hearing on how this would be an awful thing to do to this woman, and the fact of holding the hearing would keep the court from making the decision and keeping her alive longer. And he came to me and he said, I'm going to hold this hearing. And I said, well, I want you to know I disagree with this. I think it's the wrong thing to do, and I just want you to register my strong opposition. And he said, I understand. I'm doing it because my leadership wants me to do it. So he went ahead with the hearing, and we were there and raised the issues of why is the federal government, why is the Congress trying to intervene by holding a hearing on ending the life of a woman who had no more life left in her. She was brain dead. And her family wanted her to pass on. But the Republicans who believed in life, so-called, didn't want her to pass on because they wanted to keep her alive as long as they could, which was not really alive. So anyway, I was a ranking member because the Republicans were in the majority, and we decided, well, we'll work with the majority if they work with us, but if not, we'll do what we want to do. And so we used our position in the minority in a very creative way. We did reports. We did reports on the fraud and abuse of money that was carted by airplanes to Iraq to buy off the people there, giving pallets of $100 bills and just passing them out. And they had no accountability for the millions and millions of dollars they were giving away. They said they were trying to sustain the government for a while. Well, they were just passing out money. We held hearings on, after the Hurricane Katrina, how the emergency services put them in housing, temporary housing, that was filled with formaldehyde, and they were getting sick from these temporary housing, and how they needed to stop using that temporary housing. We held hearings oversight hearings on sports. We did that with Tom Davis, and we brought in famous baseball players who talked about how they use steroids to improve their performance as players, and how this was a taint on the game. It sent the message, if you cheat, it's okay. And it encouraged young people, as far as I was concerned, if they wanted to be like their sports heroes, to use drugs to improve their performance, which is a very bad message to send because these drugs are very, very serious. So the first part of the hearing was to bring in family members who talked about their kids who committed suicide because of the use of these drugs. We worked together on that hearing when I was in the minority, and we worked together when I was chairman. And just sometimes an oversight hearing doesn't lead to legislation. It just leads to a spotlight on a problem that leads to a solution. You don't always need a new law. Sometimes you need to enforce existing ones, but sometimes when people realize they can't defend what they've been doing and how they've been acting, they change. And that's an accomplishment in itself. But oversight is maybe even more important than legislation, in my view.
You were willing to disrupt some norms within Congress, such as confronting seniority norms in order to become a committee chairman. To what extent do you believe members today are willing to take norm-challenging positions? And was that set of decisions you made one that you would go back and make again?
I've always looked for opportunities to do things, to get things done. And when Paul Rogers left the chairmanship of his subcommittee, it meant there was an open chairmanship. There were a couple people senior to me. One was from Virginia, David Satterfield. He was from the old Byrd machine, which was right-wing Democrat or right-wing Republican, whatever it was. And I didn't think he could get the votes of the Democratic caucus, which makes the decision by secret ballot as a result of some of the reforms that passed before I got to Congress. But I didn't think he could get the majority of the Democrats in the Democratic caucus of the full committee. And he decided not to run. Then there was another Democrat, Richardson Pryor. He was from North Carolina, a moderate to liberal member, good on civil rights. But I argued there were two reasons I would be better, even though I was junior. One, I had a lot of experience in the health policy area, but more importantly, he came from a family fortune, the Richardson Merrill Pharmaceutical Company. And it would be a conflict of interest for him to be the chairman of the committee that regulates the FDA. He argued he would just recuse himself from issues dealing with the FDA. So how can you have a chairman of a committee recuse himself from a policy area that's so important? And besides, it didn't stop the FDA from knowing if they made decisions that could affect him positively or negatively economically. So he had a conflict of interest. But the thing that really hurt him was he would not acknowledge, in fact, he denied that cigarette smoking was harmful. He came from North Carolina. They had a large tobacco industry. He didn't want to say anything negative about tobacco industry. I said, this is the leading cause of preventable death in the United States. If this is an issue for the health committee, it seems incomprehensible to me. And so I argued that the Democrats should support me, and I won a narrow victory and became the chairman of that subcommittee 4 years after I got to Congress. And I was there for 16 years and passed many of the laws during that period of time, because at that moment in history, the subcommittee chairs in our committee had a lot of independence. We could hire our own staff, and while we worked with the full committee staff, they deferred to us. So it was a great opportunity for me to really get entrenched in these issues. And other times, I looked for rules. For example, when John Dingell was trying to pass a bad clean air law, and we had a markup, there was a rule that said no committee or subcommittee could vote on legislation when the House was in session without a unanimous approval by the House. So there was a period of time in the beginning of the session where somebody would come in and ask for unanimous consent the committee go ahead and meet and continue with their business. I showed up on the floor and objected. And then when they tried to start the markup in the committee, I said, I'm sorry, you don't have permission from the House. So I stopped the markup. I would use that strategy, worked for a while until the Republicans changed the rules, not to allow anybody to stop it. So I looked for opportunities within the rules, within the structure, within a sense of what I thought was fair. And there were tools to be used, not barriers to keep me from trying to do the best I could.
I think we have time for one last question. Is there any advice you would give to new members of Congress that might help them down the path to becoming effective lawmakers themselves?
Yeah, I've been asked this question, not by too many people, but a couple. The man who succeeded me was one who asked. And I said, you're a member of Congress. Figure out what you want to do. Figure out where you can have an impact. It's easier if you're on the committee of jurisdiction because you can get the committee to move, you can ask the questions, you can try to push them. But that shouldn't be a reason for you not to do something. I always gave the example of a colleague of mine who came in. He was on the Energy and Commerce Committee, he was on the Oversight Subcommittee, he was a very active person on the issues, but he had a strong interest in military issues of first strike and the mutually assured destruction between the United States and the Soviet Union. And he brought in experts to meet with him, academics, military experts. He was not an institution. He was not an institutional person to be looked at to resolve these issues, but he brought them in. People wanted to come in and talk to their congressmen. Academics, people who knew things, wanted to talk to somebody who was interested in the issue. And by the time he was finished, he came up with a way to be sure that a first strike failed if it was a war that broke out between the United States and the Soviet Union. And it became the military doctrine that, because of the work he had done. That young man was Al Gore, and he played a tremendous role. He and I worked together on an issue where the pharmaceutical industry was trying to extend their monopoly, their patent, so no one can compete against them. They said they had to take up too much time at the FDA to get their drugs approved, and they couldn't sell their drugs until they were approved. They should get credit for that time added on to their patent. Well, I could see why they'd want that, but that just meant that consumers had to pay a higher price, whatever the companies wanted to charge for drugs, because they couldn't get any market pressure, competition to hold down the price after the exclusivity, after the patent was over. It's an issue we're still facing. So they tried to get legislation to extend their patents. It was so popular because the pharmaceutical industry is so strong that it was put on the suspension calendar at the end of the session, where you needed 2/3 vote, and they thought they'd get their 2/3 vote. A bill had already passed the Senate. If it passed the House, it would go to the President and get signed. So Al Gore and I went to Democrats. There weren't any Republicans we could talk to, and said, you got to vote no on this. And we only needed to get 1/3 plus one of the members, which we were able to do and stop the bill. Well, they could then go to the Rules Committee and get a rule, but Congressman Bowling from Missouri was chairman of the Rules Committee. He was a liberal Southerner, as was Al Gore, a liberal Southerner from Tennessee, and Bowling was from Missouri. And they had a good relationship, so he went and talked to Bowling and said, don't give that bill a rule. It's a bad bill. And so they couldn't get it passed before the end of the session. Well, that just meant using the rules where you see an opportunity to use them. In the next Congress, I was able to pass what became known as the Hatch-Waxman Act, where we gave more time for the pioneering drug company, but we insisted there be immediate competition from generic drugs. And that gave birth to the whole generic drug industry, which has saved trillions of dollars in the price of drugs for people and payers for these pharmaceuticals. So those are just two examples of, you use the rules, you go in there and fight. Sometimes you can control it, sometimes you can't, but you just try to figure out what you can do. Don't just show up, vote, and then go home.
Thank you so much for your time and for sharing your expertise with us.
Thank you.